Good morning. I'm John Fortier. I'm a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm here with a fabulous panel to discuss a book, After the People Vote, A Guide to the Electoral College, a book in its fourth edition. I'm the editor and author, but it is a book that has a long history with AEI, with many of the people associated with AEI. And it's a time that we can reflect back on the 2020 election and think about some of the ways in which the Electoral College has been working more recently, and of course, think about the future. I'm going to introduce our panel first, and then say a few more things about the book and get right into the discussion. We have with us today from AEI, a senior fellow, Karlyn Bowman, who I will explain a little bit more about the chapter, but she's got a new chapter in this book. We've added a chapter on public opinion, and Karlyn, if you know her, is one of the world's leading experts on public opinion, really taking this topic back to the beginning of what we know about what people have been thinking about the Electoral College for the last 80 years or so, and really shedding some light that we hadn't had in the book before. We also have with us Adam White, who's a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute as well, also a assistant professor of law and head of the Boyd and Gray Center at the law school, and a commenter on election law and other legal matters. And then finally joining us is Derek Muller, who's a professor of law at the University of Iowa, and again, an expert on election law and the Electoral College in particular. So we are well served by this panel. Let me flash up on the screen a copy of the cover of the new edition of the book. You'll see that this book, which you can find on Amazon or also on the AEI website, has a picture of the bringing of the ballots into Congress, but also some of the people who've contributed to this book. I think that's probably enough for people to see now, but we'll be hoping you'll take a look further down the road. Let's hold this timeline for a little bit later, but let me say something about the book. The book began a very long time ago, and there are many people to thank, but the first edition of this book was in 1980. And we have to mention the most important person, the founder of this book is Walter Burns, who many at AEI knew very well. He's a teacher of mine and a colleague of mine at AEI as well. But Walter, without giving the long bio of Walter, he was really a great scholar of the Constitution and American institutions, but I would also say a great lover of the American Constitution and institutions, one who really cared about those institutions and his country. And this book really began as a way of explaining the Electoral College to a wider audience, to really answer some of the important questions people had about how it worked, and especially given the title of all of the things that happen after the people vote in November, all of the processes that take place, and the various instances and circumstances that could lead to different subsequent processes going forward. You know, Walter, the first book was really quite a slim book. The current book is not so long either. It's meant to be a handbook, but it really was this core set of questions that people ask about how do the electors get appointed? Who are they? What happens when they're voting in December? What happens when Congress counts the votes, and other circumstances such as contingent elections and other things that we have in our constitutional and institutional framework. That still is the core of the book today. We've of course updated that section several times to reflect new developments. We've added some new questions, but around the book over time, and Walter edited the second edition as well, we've added pro and con essays, and I think Adam White is going to talk a little bit more about them. Certainly Walter himself and Martin Diamond had contributed essays over the time to be in favor of the Electoral College. We also have essays in history. Our colleague Norm Ornstein written about the early 19th century elections that really mattered to the Electoral College. I contributed one later on the 2000 election. And then we added again Karlyn Bowman's chapter this edition, which really is about public opinion. So again, we think this book is meant to really explain the Electoral College in a way that's accessible, but also one that really takes very seriously our institutions in the spirit that Walter Burns put it together in the first place. So with that, I think we should kick off our discussion, and I hope the discussion will take into account a number of facets of the book, the legal workings of it, the public opinion, pro and con. But I want to start a little bit with what we learned about the Electoral College this past election. And I'll say a few things, and then maybe I'll turn to Derek. And I think just given the all of the controversies we had, we certainly talked about a lot of these processes. So just to tick off a few, and we'll have more discussion. One is that we had an interesting Supreme Court case over the summer related to this question of the faithless elector, the elector who doesn't vote the way they're expected to vote or bound to vote in December, as they're supposed to do. And we've had cases of those through the years. The book tries to document how many there were. But we had a court case which affirmed some states' new laws, which are really much stronger in binding those electors and keeping them from voting the wrong way. It turned out we didn't have faithless electors this time. We had very significant, still small, but significant number in 2016. But we didn't have them this time. But certainly the court had weighed in a way that made our institutional framework a little bit different. Second, I think we saw the question of what if there is some other institution of government, maybe a state legislature, who appoints a second slate of electors. Is that appropriate? It didn't actually happen this time, but we certainly heard a lot of talk that it might happen. Is it appropriate? What are the limits on it? What would happen to those electors if they got to Congress and Congress had to count two sets of electors? That's something we certainly talked a fair amount about. A third point I think we saw this election was this question of, well, what if some other people appointed themselves electors or sent some information into Washington that said, we are the electors, but we're waiting to see if maybe the legislature or the governor will give us an official stamp of approval. We had an old precedent from 1960 or 1961 where something was done in that regard. It didn't again happen, that nobody stepped in to say these are legitimate electors, but certainly there was talk that perhaps that would happen and what would happen with these electors. There's much to say, but I guess the last area, which I think is on everybody's mind, is this question of on January 6th, which many people now know is the date that Congress counts the electoral votes. A couple of questions that were big, and we have at least more information about. And a simple one is, what is the vice president's role? The vice president sitting in the chair while those electoral votes are counted. I think broadly speaking, the older understanding was that role was somewhat limited, and generally the chair of a senator who's chairing the House or the Senate does not have an all-powerful role. But I think you did see the vice president defining his role in a much more limited way, even though there was pressure to expand that role. He stood back and said, my role is not one to really make the decisions, but to preside over this group. And finally, on January 6th, obviously the big question of what about Congress counting the votes or objecting to these electoral votes? And here, of course, we have the horrible circumstance of January 6th, where there was an attack on the Capitol and violence. But if we can put that aside, which is hard to do, we think that what about this question of should Congress at all be objecting to electors, or when should they be, and what's the status of them? And I think I'd like to hear Derek on this. Derek, I think, had a very interesting piece which noted, of course, this election we saw more of that in a very significant way, many more people doing that. But we'd also seen some relatively recent other cases of that in the 2000s where there were some objections made, and sometimes objections considered by the Senate, and whether that's appropriate. And I guess one thought I have, a big picture thought, which is hard to define as a very precise matter, is that broadly speaking, it's probably true that Congress should not be objecting to the results of the state elections that are decided by states for the most part, in the sense that there should be great deference to what the states decided their election result was and appointed electors in December. That still leaves open the question of some other areas that perhaps there will be some disputes about the electors themselves, faithless electors, two slates of electors, or perhaps maybe in some very extreme circumstances, there might be some ways in which Congress thinks it would try to look behind those votes. There was something extreme. But I think an earlier understanding, and probably the better understanding, is that Congress at least has a very, his role is mostly to count, and to count is usually very simple, and only in some rarer instances would they try to look behind the results, and maybe more in the case that there were some problems with the electors' votes themselves rather than the people's votes. So I put those all on the table as big things that came out of this election. I guess I'd like to turn to Derek, and then ultimately after that to Adam to think about this question. What did we learn about the Electoral College and its institutions this election, and what does that mean for going forward?
Oh, thanks, John. I think you set up a lot of terrific issues here. And yeah, I think a lot of things that you and I study, or those of us on the panel study, at times academically came into the fore, this election, and we now have some precedents and some living examples to think about. I look at three major takeaways, although there are dozens of things to think about. One is to think about this role of the courts. I think for a long time, Americans, especially after Bush versus Gore, have expected that the courts are just going to weigh in inevitably at some point in a presidential election. That it's going to be decisive, and especially the Supreme Court is going to weigh in. We saw it in 2000 in Bush versus Gore, and people have sort of been anticipating it ever since. And in 2016, when Justice Scalia passed away, there was a vacancy on the Supreme Court, and there was a question about whether or not we needed to fill that vacancy before the election. Or in 2020, when Justice Ginsburg passed away, and she was replaced by Justice Amy Coney Barrett, about needing a sort of a full suite of justices in the court to address these issues. But I think we saw the judiciary playing a fairly minimal role, and that's pretty typical in election disputes, especially post-election disputes. The electoral process plays out through secretaries of state, through administrative decision-making, through the recount and audit process. There are limited opportunities to challenge election results, and even fewer opportunities to challenge them in federal court, much less getting to the United States Supreme Court. And while there was an attempt in Texas versus Pennsylvania to insist that Texas had a right for Pennsylvania to conduct its election in a particular way, the Supreme Court sort of recognized that's not our role. And so it was, again, a circumstance where the political process played out with just sort of very limited roles for the judiciary. Occasionally on the merits, saying you sort of lack the evidence, but a lot of times saying wrong parties, wrong time, no remedy at this point. So I think it's healthy for our democracy to think about the electoral process playing out without the need for extensive judicial involvement. A second thing that I've thought about, as you raise the role of state legislatures, a lot of state legislators, individuals in state legislatures, were very upset about their election results or the conduct of the election. Some judicial decisions that arose before Election Day about how elections should be conducted. Part of this resulted because of the pandemic, because of absentee voting, because of court orders or consent decrees, whatever it might be. But there is this, it did remind us that the people do not have a direct constitutional right to vote for their presidential electors. There's a provision of the 14th Amendment that says you can't take it away, if you deny it to a subset of the people. But for the most part, it's left to the state legislatures to determine the manner of appointing electors. And all 50 states right now hold popular elections. They've been doing that everywhere since 1876, and in many states well before that. So we expect that we, the people, vote for those electors. And this was sort of the first real concerted push in the contemporary era for legislatures to think, well, not only do we have that authority, but do we have it even after Election Day? I think the better argument is it's really difficult to take that power back once you've had an election. Particularly once the state apparatus that the state legislature has defined as sort of certifying winners in states has a role to step in afterwards and pick its own electoral slate. And I think we saw a lot of sort of conflation of what individual legislators wanted and the notion that the legislatures as entities, as bodies, have this power that resides within them and act. And no legislature acted. A lot of legislators huffed and puffed at various points in time that they would have that authority, but none sort of went forward with sort of that worst case scenario, in my view. And then finally, as you sort of allude to, the vice president and congressional role. And I view this as sort of an interesting sort of two sides of a coin when it comes to counting on January 6th. That is, that someone's got to do the counting. And I think the precedent we've developed over the years has been that it really is Congress that does the counting. And there is a little bit of history, and depending on how you read the history of Thomas Jefferson's role and the like, the vice president has some role in shaping those debates. But I think the stronger history is that Congress has this role to count. And yet on the flip side, its role to count is still somewhat narrowly defined. The Constitution gives Congress the power to judge the qualifications, elections, and returns of its own members. But the electoral votes shall then be counted, which suggests a more narrow role in Congress. And it's trying to find that line of the vice president having some role, but not a very strong role in sort of moving the proceedings forward, essentially little more than what the parliamentarian might direct the vice president to do, coupled with the congressional power that, yeah, they have the power to object. I think we've seen in a number of recent elections, what I describe kind of as grievance politics happening on the floor of Congress each time that the sort of sore losers are objecting to what happened in the past election. I don't think that's very healthy. And I think, culminating in a riot is not healthy for our democracy. But reserving, John, as you point out, those limited circumstances where Congress might really need to weigh in. Then that really requires statesmanship and some sort of judicious discernment from Congress itself as an institution to decide what are those situations so extreme that we need to weigh in. It did so during Reconstruction, and it really hasn't since, and I think justifiably so. So thinking about those roles and sort of the interplay between the vice president and Congress and sort of that congressional moment that we saw and experienced. So those are the three things that I've really been thinking about.
I definitely want to turn to Adam, but maybe I could follow up with Derek, and also Adam may want to weigh on this as well. Just your second point about the role of state legislatures, or maybe I could broaden it slightly in that there's been given more credit to this debate as to the state legislatures are the institution at heart that determines how the electors are selected. They used to often do this directly, and it's still a power, but they've chosen to enact a legislative electoral code, and we follow that. We follow the law typically of how the elections are to be run. But that comes with it potentially some conflict at the edges where courts perhaps, or the state legislatures might say, boy, somebody has stepped in and really distorted that election code. There was a claim that Pennsylvania Supreme Court, for example, really came in and said, you made a decision that the legislature wouldn't have wanted, wasn't in the code, to extend the absentee ballot deadlines. There were some questions back in 2000, in the 2000 election, where perhaps all of the changes that were made by courts in the recount process really got away from that scheme. And then the difficult question of, do federal courts step in to protect the state legislature against its own courts? That's tricky, although the court, flirted with that, and certain members of the court were interested in that doctrine. Or perhaps the state legislatures after the fact. Again, Florida, there was some consideration of this. Do they do that? Now, I think it's a dangerous territory and it's difficult, but one could imagine in the extremes there might be some place for that. But just wanted to flag that issue and maybe get your thoughts and Adam's thoughts about the future of that, because I think we're gonna have some court action on that next election, and maybe it'll look different. And what's your thinking about that?
Yeah. Briefly on that, I think the Supreme Court is considering Republican Party of Pennsylvania versus Bookvar precisely on this issue about Pennsylvania in particular. And maybe the thought is, if we can have a case on a cooler record, if you will, over the next 4 years, we can provide some guidance going forward about those legislatures. But it's interesting. I do think there are there's two prongs to what's happening here. One is this notion about the legislature where its will has been usurped by the state courts or by some other process rather than the state legislative code. And that notion, especially in a pre-election day setting, I think, is a more defensible posture to say, no, you went too far in usurping the state legislature's desires. This is textually committed to the legislature to come up with the rules, not for the court to impose its will. And there's, we could spend an hour alone on sort of this concept. But the flip side of that are sort of the post-election disputes where the legislature looks at the results. It's unhappy. We've lost our veil of ignorance now. And the legislature says, well, wait a minute. We didn't sign up for this. We want to get back in there and appoint our own electors because we think the election code and the entire apparatus we set up got it wrong. And that's, I think, the really dangerous and perhaps even pernicious sort of concern to think about after Election Day. And that was, I think, some of the most sort of aggressive and hostile kinds of claims that were being made in December. So I think about sort of the flip side about it, and maybe one problem is you can't have necessarily one without the other. How much can you do pre-election without the legislature making a post-election day judgment in the same way about whether or not the election was fairly run? So it is an interesting question going forward.
Adam, you may have thoughts about this, and I know other things about what's been going on, but I know also you have some thoughts about the larger questions in the book. So love to hear from you.
Well, thanks, John, and thanks everybody. It's really great to be part of this conversation. I kept my first edition of the book well within reach the last few months, and I'm very, very excited that the new edition is out. In a way, John, the last question you asked about the state legislatures, it sort of brings me back to your first question about what we learned in this election, this process, and my basic takeaway is what we learned is that we know the rules, or at least we're very good at arguing about the rules, the text of the Constitution, what the state codes mean, all these things. But as a nation, we have a very impoverished understanding of the values and the principles and the ideas that were originally embodied in the rules, the institutions that were supposed to carry out the electoral process. That's one of the reasons why I love this book so much and why it was so useful in the electoral process. In addition to sort of the black letter law of the electoral process that you have in here, and the more up-to-date studies of opinion and people's understandings of these institutions in our modern time, I go back over and over again to these essays by Martin Diamond and Walter Burns, two of the great constitutional thinkers of the 20th century, and obviously a big part of AEI's history too, because both their essays in particular really point us back to the way that the founders grappled with what was at stake, how they grappled towards what ultimately became the Electoral College in the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. I love the way the Martin Diamond's essay starts. He stakes out some basic principles about what the point of the Electoral College is. And he starts right away, I won't go through all of them, but he starts right away by saying, first and above all, electors were not devised as an undemocratic substitute for popular will, but rather as a nationalizing substitute for state legislatures. This idea, today, especially over the last few elections, we've come to think about the Electoral College often in counter-majoritarian terms. But Diamond reminds us, and when you look back at the debates in 1787, it's very, very clear the whole point of the Electoral College was coming up with a rational framework to get the sense of the majority, the national majority, not direct democracy, but as with everything else in our Constitution, sort of the deliberate sense, the public reason filtered through some majoritarian institutions that weren't sort of aggressively, swiftly majoritarian, but filtered the majority through some institutions, while still in the end, in the long run, doing justice to the majority. And so the framers, as Diamond points out, and as people can see in Madison's notes of the debates, they were trying to come up with a way to come up with a sense of the nation as a whole, but in a country that was very, it was an immense new continent with poor communication and so on. We were technologically limited in what we could do. They wanted a deliberate and Republican process, but one that did justice to the separation of powers. So you couldn't just have the Congress pick the president. They wanted a deliberate and Republican process, but one that would avoid cabal. And so they didn't want the Electoral College was a kind of momentary institution, right? Almost like a parallel Congress that would come into being in the states very briefly without the opportunity for domestic cabal, foreign influence, and so on. But then we look at all that and we think about how much has changed, right, beginning from the 12th Amendment onward. And I'd really encourage our audience to go find the article that Josh Hawley wrote about the 12th Amendment. Obviously, his legacy in the Electoral College is a little more complicated right now. But he wrote this amazing essay, the article about 10 years ago, about how the 12th Amendment really changed the way we think about presidential politics, and on from there. And so the great challenge, to come back to your sort of second question, the great challenge for us now is to think about the rules but as embodying those principles that I think still stand, and surely Walter Burns and Martin Diamond would say still stand. This importance of recognize Electoral College as a means to certain ends, and that's the point of Walter Burns's essay, by the way. That the framer today we talk about the Electoral College in terms of input. Should it be more democratic in the small d sense? Should it be more direct democracy? And Burns says you're looking through the wrong end of the telescope. He says in his essay, we need to look at the outputs as much as the inputs and think about what kind of statesman the Electoral College was supposed to create, and then reason backwards to how do we come up with a process that delivers more often than not the right kind of character in our presidents and in our political processes. And so when we look at the question about state legislatures, right, what's their role in this? To be sort of working on behalf of the people, right? Not to trump the will of the people. Sorry, that was not an intentional pun. Not to overtake the will of the people, but to help facilitate the will of the people through the electoral processes. The founders knew that each state would be different in how they administered elections. And so the state legislatures have a key role before the fact. After the fact, it has to be pretty limited. We look at Congress, we were even debating the role of the vice president in counting these things. And as you and Derek both put it, surely there has to be space for Congress to intervene in rare occasions when the will of the people really is somehow being usurped. But in a limited way, and as Derek said, it requires a real statesman-like approach to politics to know when to intervene and when not. What worries me, I'll just end on this, what worries me about the debates about the Electoral College now is I think the Electoral College's most vocal defenders they've come to defend it more and more in counter-majoritarian terms, right? You'll hear them say, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. Yes, the Electoral College can sustain, occasionally results that go against the national popular vote, right? But if we ever reach a point where that is becoming a real feature and not a bug of the Electoral College, I think we're going to have real problems. And I think the Electoral College's defenders, in some ways, are going to turn out to be its worst enemies if they reframe the Electoral College really in counter-majoritarian terms, because that's not that was not the point of Madison, Hamilton, James Wilson, Gouverneur Morris, all the people that were arguing for the Electoral College. They really wanted an institution that would give the sense of the majority, but again, as with everything else in our Constitution, the reason, not the passion of the people. And so to the extent the Electoral College doesn't play that role anymore, I think we need to think about what we might call auxiliary protections, right, elsewhere in the process, other rules, other norms, to help bring the system as a whole back towards what the framers had in mind for it. I just want to point out, by the way, it's a happy coincidence that we're doing this conversation on President Lincoln's birthday, both because obviously Walter Burns was such an admirer of him, but we keep doubling back to statesmanship and sort of national politics, national democracy, and Lincoln really is the greatest example of all.
Thank you, Adam. I'm going to turn to Karlyn, but I first have some administrative business to do here. So I want to remind the audience that we are looking forward to your questions, and we're going to have Karlyn talk and have a little discussion, but we're looking for your input. And so the way that you can do that is on the one hand by sending an email to samantha.goldstein@aei.org, or also on Twitter with the hashtag #AfterThePeopleVote. So again, we'll turn to that shortly. Let me turn to Karlyn, and we certainly, again, want to hear about public opinion, the new chapter in the book, but I think that's also going to lead us into some questions that Adam raised about possible changes in the Electoral College. What do people think about those things, and what are some of the options out there? What's the likelihood? So let's hear from Karlyn. We'll have a little discussion, and then again, we'll turn to your questions sent in the way that I just mentioned.
Thanks very much, John. And it's a pleasure to be here today, but it's a pleasure to welcome you back to AEI after a few years away. Several years ago, John volunteered to update the third edition of After the People Vote, and I think you and the authors have created an AEI classic. So congratulations on that. I'm going to make 5 general points about public views on the Electoral College. But first, I thought it would be important to start with a little history. John said earlier that the first question about the Electoral College was asked many, many years ago. In fact, it was asked in 1944. George Gallup asked his used in-person interviews to ask people how much they knew about the Electoral College and how it worked. People weren't very knowledgeable at that time, and I suspect if you ask those questions today, you'd get the same result overall. Gallup has had a long-standing interest in questions about the Electoral College, and I'll explain a little bit more about George Gallup's interest later. But Gallup has asked by far more questions than any other pollster on the Electoral College, and they've come in spurts. Between 1948 and 1965, there were 10 questions, and in those questions, between 51 and 63% told the firm's interviewers that the system of electing the president should be changed. In the late 1960s, after Lyndon Johnson suggested eliminating the Electoral College, and the American Bar Association weighed in with its own report on the Electoral College, Gallup was in the field once again. In this case, in 6 identically worded questions asked from 1967 to 1980, Gallup began his question this way: would you approve or disapprove of an amendment to the Constitution which would do away with the Electoral College and base the election of a president on the total popular vote cast throughout the nation? Majorities, once again, ranging from a low of 58% to a high of 80% in a question asked right after the 1968 election. A handful of questions were asked in the early 1990s when President George Herbert Walker Bush faced Bill Clinton and H. Ross Perot. There was majority support, once again, for eliminating the Electoral College. But in an interesting question asked at that time about whether the new party being formed by Ross Perot should focus on amending the Constitution to eliminate the Electoral College, the idea didn't rank very high as a priority for the American people. Before the 2000 election, perhaps anticipating a close election, Gallup and Newsweek pollsters told registered voters that it was possible for a presidential candidate to finish second in the national popular vote, but still capture electoral votes in enough states to win the White House. People were then asked if Al Gore or George W. Bush were to be elected president in this way, whether it would seriously hurt their ability to be an effective national leader. 21% said that it would, but 70% said that it would not. There are far more pollsters in the field now than there were in the 60s and 70s, and several of the major network pollsters polled Americans about the Electoral College in the 35 days after the imbroglio over the 2000 contest. And once again, solid majorities in the low 50s to the low 60s said that they preferred direct popular election. Gallup's 2016 question, asked soon after that election, was the first time in the polls that support for abolishing the Electoral College fell below 50%. People were divided, 49% in favor and 47% opposed to eliminating it. The fate of the Electoral College interested a few pollsters after the 2020 election. 2 questions asked soon after the election showed, like the 2016 poll, an even division of opinion about abolishing it. But a January Pew poll showed opinion back in the more familiar range, with 55% saying that they were in favor of changing the current system so that the candidate who received the most votes wins the election, and 43% were in favor of keeping the current system. In recent years, several pollsters have tried to measure opinion about the National Popular Vote Compact, including the organization promoting the compact itself. I'm a skeptic of these polls because I think depending on the information that's given to people, depending on the wording that the pollsters use, you can move opinion very significantly in one direction or another. 5 things stand out from this overall collection of polls asked over a very long period of time. First, we have little information from the pollsters about how much people actually know about the Electoral College. Second, for the most part, the polls have been remarkably consistent and show majority support for eliminating the Electoral College. At times of significant media attention, after the 2016 election and immediately after the 2020 election, opinion has been more closely divided in some, but not in all polls. Third, in the modern era of polling from, let's say, the 1980s on, Democrats have always been more in favor of eliminating the Electoral College than Republicans. An interesting insight comes from a late October pre-election 2020 Morning Consult online poll and a second one that they took in mid-November after Joe Biden's victory. In the second question, Democratic support for amending the Constitution dropped almost 10 percentage points after the election of a Democratic president. Fourth, and here, Samantha, I have a slide for the audience. The partisan gap on the Electoral College, like the gaps on so many political issues today, is a chasm. After the 2000 election, a gap of 29 points separated Democrats and Republicans. That's the third print column on this slide. But the gap was 29 points. And if you look at the question that Gallup asked in September of 2020, Democrats and Republicans were separated by a gap of 66 points. You don't see gaps that large on a lot of issues these days, but certainly it is a prominent a prominent part of the very divided electorate that we have. Fifth, and finally, I want to comment on intensity. The issue never comes up as a top problem or as a top concern facing the country. Pollsters don't ask many questions about electoral reforms, but when they do, things such as term limits are far more popular than eliminating the Electoral College. As I said earlier, when Ross Perot was thinking about the priorities for his new party, the public didn't think eliminating the Electoral College should be a top priority at all. There's more interest in the issue now than in the past, and Democrats are especially passionate, though perhaps a little less so, as I said earlier, with a Democratic president. When doing the research I did for this project, I wondered why the Gallup organization was so interested in the issue. And I think I've found the answer. George Gallup graced the cover of Time magazine in May 1948. What followed was a 3-page story about his methodology and some of his findings. But at one point in the piece, Gallup told the interviewer that his fondest dream, and I'm quoting, was that Congress will someday abolish the Electoral College. I don't think that polls should ever be used to make policy because they're too blunt an instrument for that purpose. Still, it's always important to understand what the polls tell us about how Americans feel and how much they know about an issue like the Electoral College. So that's a very quick review, John.
Thank you, Karlyn. And that is just a taste of what you will get in what I will say is a really encyclopedic look at public opinion in the Electoral College. No one, I think, has ever put that together in one place. So thank you. I think two things. One, I'm gonna remind the audience that you're almost there where you can ask questions. So that if you want to send a question, you can send it to samantha.goldstein@aei.org or on Twitter after the hashtag after the people vote. But I think Karlyn's chapter and talk is a jumping off point to have a little bit of discussion about possibilities for reform, what the likelihood is. I'll just say a few things, and we haven't really gotten into the National Popular Vote Compact, and I'm not sure I'm going to have time to explain it in great detail. But for broadly speaking, for many years it was thought that the only way to reform the Electoral College would really be to go straight at it with a constitutional amendment. And there are a lot of reasons for thinking that. And that's, of course, a very high hurdle. And even though at times, especially Karlyn mentioned after a push in the 60s and early 70s, that there was some significant support in Congress for doing that, the idea of having the supermajorities in Congress and 3/4 of the state legislatures pass something means there would have to be a very broad consensus. The National Popular Vote Compact uses the fact that state legislatures have a real power in appointing electors. We've talked about that before, and sort of essentially ask states to transfer their power to choose their electors to choosing electors that win the national vote rather than ones that win their own state. If enough states chose to do that, you would effectively get the national popular vote, even though you'd have all the machinery of the Electoral College lying around. I guess one thing I will say about this is it is easier. The hurdle is lower. You really just need to persuade a number of states, their state legislatures, to pass laws in states that add up to 270 electoral votes, rather than getting these larger supermajorities and amending the Constitution. One outcome of this last election, I think, was that the state legislatures did not move as much in the Democratic direction as some thought. And while there is some support on both sides of the aisle for these changes, the real push for the National Popular Vote Compact has come in Democratic states. States have passed this. that are blue states. Interestingly, a few smaller blue states have resisted. There was some resistance in Maine and Nevada. We could talk about that. But broadly speaking, they're going to need to move into purple states and maybe some slightly red states to really get to that majority. And at least at this point, I think that interest there in the state legislatures probably isn't there in the near future. But again, it is a lower hurdle. And so I think this will be the primary mode for reform in the Electoral College in the coming years, rather than the straight constitutional amendment to change it. So I don't know if Derek and Adam have thoughts about either that specifically or broadly about possible change in the Electoral College.
Yeah, I'll jump in because I want to build off of something both Adam and Karlyn raised in different contexts, which is, I think Adam raised the point that a lot of Republicans have been defending the Electoral College in this sort of counter-majoritarian mode. And Karlyn's point that especially in recent years, the last 20 years, there's been a huge partisan gap in how support for the Electoral College has existed, a really widening chasm between Democrats and Republicans. And I think about this, in the 60s when the reform efforts began, it was really kind of out of two elections. The election of 1960, which was an extremely close election between the Republican and Democratic candidates, both in the Electoral College and in the national popular vote, somewhat similar to 2000. With a number of controversies that arose in some states there and some difficulties of faithless electors and the like. And then in 1968, where despite the fact that Richard Nixon won by, relatively speaking, I suppose, a landslide, it was also a situation where there was a third party candidate with a significant sort of attraction of support and potentially no majority winner. And it was also out of a moment where we were amending the Constitution fairly significantly on a number of matters relating to elections, abolishing the poll tax, electoral votes for the District of Columbia, things like that. And so there was sort of a nonpartisan moment around 1970 to think about this, and it sort of fell away. Whereas the efforts in the last 20 years have really been pitched as Democrats really upset about the election of 2000 and more so in 2016 and saying this is the way for us to win again. And I think, as Karlyn points out, after mid-November of 2020, Democrats aren't as opposed to the Electoral College if their candidate can win. Whereas on the flip side, Republicans are looking at this as sort of like, well, this is the only way we can win by preserving this sort of system where we're in the minority and it converts our preferences into the majority. And I don't think either of these are sort of healthy narratives as we're moving toward reform efforts. I think it's a suggestion that reform's going to be very difficult if it's cast through that partisan lens. But I also think, as Adam pointed out, that if Republicans' argument is we need something that empowers the minority to translate its will, that's not necessarily the most persuasive argument that's going to last and be sustainable as reform efforts move forward.
Thinking about what Derek just said and what Karlyn said, in some ways, the debates that we see right now about the Electoral College, they very much mirror the debates that we're having around the Supreme Court and questions about fundamental changes to that institution in light of sort of momentary sort of changes in political winds. And so I'm very, very wary of it. Focusing on the national popular vote specifically, I'm very, very wary of that in particular, because it really does sort of put the state legislatures in the position of effectively, I won't say disenfranchising members of their states, but having the state's electoral votes be rooted in something other than the voters within that state themselves. Just thinking through what the playing out the sort of the logic and dynamics of that, it might radically change our national politics, and so I'm wary of that. I wonder. I'm getting way out over my skis when I suggest this. So Derek, Karlyn, John, feel free to reel me in. But I wonder if how much of the debate ought to focus on reform of the primary process. Actually, if we're going to have a constitutional amendment surrounding the electoral process, I think the first place I'd like to look is some sort of constitutionalization of the primary process. Maybe to make it the primary process a more national process, a more sort of direct democracy within the parties. And then when the winners of those contests face off, they're still filtered through the Electoral College, hopefully in a way that then again, promotes the sense of the nation as a whole, but filtered through a process. So if we're going to have more majoritarianism, more direct democracy, I guess I'd rather see it happen first in the primary process before we really start changing the national electoral process.
I'm gonna let people weigh in on that if they want to, the questions, but I am going to turn to the audience questions, and so some of this may come up as well. So here's a question, and I have to admit this one is dear to my heart, but I worry we might get into the weeds here. Amazingly, I don't think we mentioned these words in the discussion so far. But the question is, how should Congress amend the federal law governing the Electoral College? That is, the Electoral Count Act, in light of the events surrounding the 2000 election. And again, I think the book has a long history, so it hasn't taken sides on the most recent controversies, but certainly talks about the Electoral Count Act. We have it printed in the appendix and refer to it throughout the book. It is a law that was passed a little bit after, but certainly in reaction to the 1876 election, one of our most contentious elections, one where we really had several cases of states with two sets of electors, really almost two kind of governments of these states coming out of the Civil War and Reconstruction, where there were just bitter disputes that went all the way up to almost Inauguration Day. And that act is meant to give some structure to the process, both the way the votes are cast, the electors, and how they get to Washington, but also to some extent how Congress is going to deal with some of these issues. And there's a lot of debate about that. I think there is a question. Many people are asking, could we just reform this act? Could we improve everything? I have a quick view, and I'd be interested to hear the others. Look, I think there could be some changes that would be beneficial. I think the law provides a lot of benefits. I do think there is some push that this law could lock Congress down on every detail in every case. And there I am a little more skeptical. I think that Congress actually does have some powers. We've talked about how they should probably be very limited because they're mostly counting the votes. But for Congress by a law to tell a later Congress, in this case, you need to vote for the slates that have the governor's signature, and we're going to be clear about this, and don't stray from that. I guess in these rare cases where it's controversial and the House and Senate feel very strongly about something, there's a question of whether that's constitutional, whether it impinges on Congress's power, but it's also a question of whether it's realistic to think that Congress would actually go along with that. So I think some reform might be useful. We could talk about a lot of things, but I think the aim of the reformers might be too strong to think that we could fix all of these problems by a law just if we were a little clearer about it. So.
Well, I tend to agree, John. I will say the one thought I have on this as a modest reform is right now the Electoral Count Act requires Congress to separate in the middle of the counting for up to 2 hours of debate upon the objection filed in writing by one member of the House and one senator. And I remember when I was talking to reporters this fall about it, they said, why doesn't this happen all the time? And maybe we go back to this sort of statesmanship, right? For a long time, Congress wasn't going to do that. And in 2001 and in 2017, a number of members of the House, Democrats in the House, tried to object, but no senator would join them. And then in 2005, Senator Barbara Boxer joined an objection. So there was a 2-hour debate about Ohio. And then, of course, famously, as we saw now last month, Senator Ted Cruz joined an objection to Arizona, Senator Josh Hawley to one in Pennsylvania, and that forced another 2 hours twice of debate. And so in my judgment, like a simple solution would be a mechanism that requires not just one member of the House and one member of the Senate, but maybe something like 1/5 of the members of the House and 1/5 of the Senate. And I think about that, I like to lodge it in some other experience, right? The Constitution requires if 1/5 of the members of the legislature want, then the journal's notes will be reported along those lines. So I think about some requirement, some deterrent to just one person stepping in to suggest that there's really something that merits 2 hours of debate, that there's a substantial minority in both chambers that think this is something that merits discussion. Now, maybe that's not enough, but maybe it cools the passions for a period of time until sort of this sort of experience of the last 20 years weighs off. or wears off, and we move back to a situation where most of the counts are uncontroversial. But I don't know. I think about that as sort of a very modest attempt to smooth the process.
I think that's great. I think we've seen the electoral counting process devolve into just a matter of assertion, right? And it needs to be in Congress, to the extent that Congress has a substantive role to play, it really has to be one of persuasion, not assertion. And so I think what Derek just said is a great point, and maybe finding other ways to ratchet up supermajority requirements along the way within Congress's process too, just increasing those so that it can't just be a bare majority. But I agree with Derek's original premise that there's only so much you can do to write these rules in advance, right? And over time, we'll remember the rules, but we'll forget why we have them, and we'll find ourselves sort of having gamesmanship around the new rules. And so, in a way, I think fixing the rules is good, but really reasserting the quality and character of the process is the most important.
So I have another question here, and that is, what is the possibility of changing the number of electoral college votes within each state and dividing them up to be one in different areas of the state rather than having winner take all as it is in most states now? Would that be a fairer system? So I put it out there to you. I have thoughts, but Derek, Karlyn, Adam?
I'll go first, maybe. I'm increasingly inclined in favor of this. Maybe Derek and Karlyn could tell me why it's a terrible idea, but maybe moving away somehow from winner take all would lower the stakes, right, in any given state, and also would help give better voice to sort of more weight to the voice of the minority within each state. So that in a way would move us towards it wouldn't move us to a national popular vote, but it would move us towards a sort of more weight to the national sense as a whole.
So, I guess I will say that, actually, Derek, do you want to?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, I've had that instinct too, Adam, but here's the counter, and I think about it, and maybe it's the way we want it, right? Right now, winner take all does translate fairly narrow victories into much more substantial ones, and makes, I think, first a greater legitimacy claim to the victor, and second, a more stable outcome pending faithless electors. It also, when we think about the alternative, let's say having district system like Maine and Nebraska do, it ratchets up the risks of partisan gerrymandering when we draw congressional districts. So there's an additional pressure now in gerrymandering. And then when you sort of have winner take all, again, you're more likely to get 300, 350 electoral votes. Whereas in a proportional system or a district system, you're going to have more instances where there's no majority winner, where nobody gets 270 votes, in which case the election goes to the House of Representatives for a choice, which we haven't done since 1824, and I hope we don't see anytime soon. So there are alternatives to think about it. Well, maybe you require, it's winner take all if you win a majority of the state, or it's winner take all in each district, or we have an instant runoff system so there aren't sort of third-party spoilers. Because if we had done this in the 2016 presidential election, it's possible that Evan McMullen and Jill Stein and Gary Johnson each would have received electoral votes, depending on how you do sort of your districts or proportional allocation or whatever it might be. So there are challenges, I think, to thinking about even some of those reforms. That's not to say they're impossible, but they do introduce new problems that we would have to think about remedying too.
Yeah, a few brief things. I agree with Derek. One of the consequences of this on the redistricting issue is we would have these districts, which are creations of the state and creations every 10 years rather than states which have fixed boundaries. So there would be an issue there. But I guess a couple of things on the other side to think about. Interestingly, we actually have had this become consequential. For a number of years, we had these laws in Maine and Nebraska, which people say, oh, that's a nice bit of trivia. But of course, we've had Barack Obama win in Nebraska, and then Donald Trump in Maine a couple times, and now Joe Biden win in Nebraska. So people are competing for those districts, and so that does make it an interesting point. One of the side features of the Electoral College sometimes people point to is that it forces candidates to really get out to places. I think the fact that it's states is probably a good thing because states are real political entities. You care about the politics of Ohio and other places, but it still does get you out to a number of different places. And these district systems, while it's a smaller factor, they do preserve the winner take all aspect because two of the electors from the state are still going to the winner. It's a smaller prize in most cases, or in all cases, but it is interesting to see how the parties have responded to the incentives to appeal to voters in these places that have actually been winning in places where they couldn't win the state, but they can win a district. And so it adds a layer of complexity of places where candidates are going in the country that cuts a little bit against the argument that candidates aren't really spending their time in as many places. So, I think we have one last question possible to answer. And this is a very general one, but I think it's interesting because we don't think about the Electoral College as much in this context. And the question is, why is the presidential transition period so long? And you can take some other consequences of that. So anybody want to take that one on?
I mean, it's a funny question when you consider how much longer the transitions used to be, right?
Yes.
Up until FDR, the transition, I guess inauguration date was the beginning of March, right? Our government is extremely big. I mean, there's a lot that's happening, and I do think you do need a substantial amount of time for an incoming administration to really learn what really is going on and to have an opportunity to staff people up. I mean, you'd hate to have the campaigns front loading all of their presidential staffing decisions like during the election. I think right now we have it just about right.
Yeah, I will say, I think Adam's right that we had a longer transition period, but compared to most countries of the world, that transition is very long. And in 10 Downing Street, the moving trucks show up quite quickly after the election is called, almost immediately. And I think we would have some problems making that sort of transition. But I guess the other question it raises is we have all this machinery between November election and January 20th. And some of it we talked about why it's necessary, but even the decisions of the states holding these recounts, I think it's in a way good that we give states some time to really resolve these things. And some people have argued maybe we should have more time, push the election time back for when the electors meet. On the other hand, it's still a pretty significant amount of time. Maybe arguably people would take more of the time, would argue more to the last bit, and maybe we should find a way to. I actually think it would be good to find a way if we could be a little quicker in our recounts and clearer in our recounts and get a state result in a quicker way. And there's some larger debate about how we do that.
Yeah, I just briefly, in some ways it's not that long. I mean, it's 75 days, give or take, right? And you've got Thanksgiving holiday, Christmas, New Year's. You've got states that some states accept ballots now up until 10 days or so after the election before they'll be counted. You have to have the certification in the state followed by the potential recounts and audits. And then the electors meet and cast their votes. And then Congress has to step in because Congress has a formal role in counting their votes. And there's just a lot more steps in the process when you sort of walk through all of them. And yeah, maybe we could cut off a week or two if we really wanted to be aggressive about it. But I think in some respects, there's just a lot of stages that happen in elections. And when you look at a place like New York's 22nd congressional district, which was just resolved last week, in one election, there are instances where it runs long, and we like to have a little bit of breathing room in places like Florida in 2000 to make sure that we can kind of solve these disputes in each state.
Well, unfortunately, that we try to keep After the People Vote to be a concise and relatively brief book for people. And this event has also been relatively brief, and we've come to the end of our time. I do want to first remind people where they can find the book. They can find the book on Amazon, also at the AEI website. I'd like to thank, before I thank the panelists, all of the people that have made this book happen over the many years. The institution of AEI, I mentioned Walter Burns, the many contributors. But I'd also like to thank very much Karlyn Bowman, Adam White, and Derek Muller for joining us today. Thank you, and we'll end the event here.